On a cold night in the winter of 1945, somewhere along a narrow mountain road in Austria, 6 soldiers waited in silence. Snow pressed softly against their boots. Their breath hung in the air like smoke. The forest around them was completely still, the kind of stillness that only exists in deep winter. One of the men checked his watch. Another quietly adjusted the sling on his Sten submachine gun. They were not waiting for an army. They were waiting for one man. A man who, only months earlier, had sent thousands of people onto trains bound for extermination camps. A man who had signed deportation lists with calm efficiency while families screamed on railway platforms. A man who believed he had escaped. The soldiers watching the road had crossed half a continent to find him. And they were not the only ones. Across the ruins of post-war Europe, former Nazi officers were beginning to hear whispers. Rumors about a group of Jewish soldiers who had survived the war, and who were now hunting them, not in courtrooms, not through official investigations, but on dark roads, in train stations, and in quiet border towns where identities could vanish overnight. For many of the men being hunted, it felt like something out of a nightmare. But for the hunters themselves, the mission had begun long before that winter night. To understand why they were there, you have to go back several years earlier, to a time when the world was collapsing. In September of 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland. It was the opening act of the most destructive war in human history. Cities burned, borders disappeared. Entire populations were thrown into chaos. But for Europe's Jewish communities, the war was not simply another conflict between nations. It was the beginning of something far darker. Within months of occupying Poland, the Nazi regime began implementing policies designed to isolate and control Jewish populations. Families were forced into overcrowded ghettos. Food was rationed so tightly that starvation became common. People disappeared during night raids, taken away by Gestapo officers whose names would soon become synonymous with terror. And by 1942, the Nazi leadership had moved to the final phase of their plan, what they called the final solution. Across occupied Europe, extermination camps began operating at full capacity. Places like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor were no longer detention centers. They were factories of death. Millions would be murdered there. But not everyone was trapped inside Nazi-controlled Europe. In the years before the war, thousands of Jewish families had managed to escape. Some fled to the United States. Others found refuge in South America. And many settled in British-controlled Palestine. At first, the news arriving from Europe was fragmented and hard to believe. Stories about mass shootings in forests. Reports of entire villages vanishing. Rumors of camps where trains arrived full but never left. But by 1943, the truth was impossible to ignore. And among the Jewish communities in Palestine, a growing number of young men began demanding something from the British authorities. They wanted to fight, not simply as individuals scattered across Allied armies, but as a Jewish military unit. A force that could carry the symbol of their people into battle against Nazi Germany. The British government hesitated. The Middle East was already politically fragile, and the creation of a Jewish combat brigade raised concerns about how it might affect tensions in the region. But pressure continued to build. Finally, in September 1944, Britain approved the formation of a new unit within its army. It was called the Jewish Brigade Group. Nearly 5,000 soldiers volunteered. They were organized into 3 infantry battalions and attached to the British 8th Army. Their uniforms were the same as any other British soldiers, except for one detail. Sewn onto their sleeves was a blue and white patch with the Star of David. For many of the men wearing that symbol, the war was deeply personal. Some had fled Europe only a few years earlier. Others had relatives still trapped in cities now occupied by Nazi forces. And as more information about the Holocaust reached Allied lines, many soldiers realized something devastating. Entire communities they once knew no longer existed. Cities like Warsaw, Vilnius, and Krakow had lost nearly all of their Jewish populations. Synagogues stood empty. By early 1945, the Jewish Brigade was deployed to the front lines in northern Italy. Their objective was part of the Allied push against the last German defensive positions in the region. The front stretched along the Senio River. German units had fortified the riverbanks with machine gun nests, artillery positions, and minefields. The brigade fought there during the final Allied offensive of the war. The battles were brutal but short. By April 1945, German resistance in northern Italy began collapsing. Within weeks, Nazi forces across Europe were surrendering. On May 8th, the war in Europe officially ended. But peace did not arrive overnight. Instead, the continent entered a strange and chaotic period. Millions of displaced people moved across destroyed landscapes, searching for surviving family members. Cities lay in ruins, governments were trying to rebuild. And amid the confusion, thousands of Nazi officials began disappearing. SS officers removed their uniforms. Gestapo agents adopted false names. Some fled toward Austria and southern Germany. Others tried to reach ports where ships could carry them to South America. In the chaos of post-war Europe, it was surprisingly easy to vanish. For Holocaust survivors, the idea that the people responsible for unimaginable crimes might simply escape was unbearable. Within the Jewish Brigade, a small group of officers began discussing something that had never been officially approved. If the Allies could not track down every war criminal, they would, quietly, carefully, and without waiting for permission. The effort was organized by intelligence officers within the brigade, many of whom had experience in underground resistance networks before joining the army. Small teams were formed. Their mission was simple: find Nazi fugitives and make sure they never escaped justice. The teams began operating across northern Italy, Austria, and southern Germany. They gathered information from Holocaust survivors, resistance fighters, and local civilians who had witnessed deportations during the war. Some even remembered their faces. When a lead appeared, the teams moved quickly. They used British military vehicles and forged documents to travel between Allied occupation zones. Sometimes they posed as military police conducting investigations. Other times they pretended to be American intelligence officers. Their targets were almost always hiding under false identities. But war criminals carried a problem that fake documents could not solve. People remembered them. One operation took place near the Austrian border during the summer of 1945. A Jewish brigade team set up a roadside checkpoint along a quiet mountain road. When the car approached, they stepped forward and asked for identification. For a moment, it looked convincing. Then one of the soldiers studying the man's face froze. He recognized him. The officer must have seen the recognition in his eyes, because suddenly he turned and ran. The burst from the Sten gun lasted only seconds. When the echo of the gunfire faded, the road was silent again. And another name had been removed from the list of men who thought they could disappear. Stories like this began circulating quietly among former SS officers. Whispers about Jewish soldiers moving across Europe with lists of names. Men who had once commanded ghettos now avoided public places. They changed hotels frequently. Some carried weapons wherever they went. But fear spreads quickly in communities built on secrecy. And soon the rumors grew into something larger. The Nazi hunters were coming. One of the most dangerous missions took place later that year in the mountains of Austria. A senior Gestapo officer named Alexander Müller had reportedly fled toward the Alps. During the war, Müller had overseen deportations from Krakow to Auschwitz. Thousands had died because of decisions he signed with a pen. Now he was attempting to escape south with several other former SS officers. Their destination was believed to be Italy. From there, they hoped to reach South America. The Jewish Brigade commandos tracked them along a narrow mountain road outside Innsbruck. It was winter again. Snow covered the slopes. Visibility was poor. The commandos chose a bend in the road where vehicles would be forced to slow down. They waited there for hours in the freezing dark. Then headlights appeared. 2 vehicles. A staff car in front. A truck following behind. The soldiers stepped into the road and raised their weapons. For a moment, it seemed the vehicles might stop. But someone inside the truck realized what was happening. The engine roared. Gunfire exploded into the night. The SS officers had machine guns. Bullets ripped through the trees as the Jewish soldiers dove for cover behind rocks and snowbanks. The quiet mountain road turned into chaos. One commando was wounded in the shoulder. Another struggled with a weapon jammed by the cold. The truck's machine gun hammered the darkness again and again, pinning the team down. If the vehicles broke through the ambush, the fugitives would vanish into the mountains. The mission would fail. Then one of the commandos began crawling forward through the snow. His name was Moshe Taver. In his hand he carried a single grenade. The machine gun continued firing from the back of the truck, but the gunner could not see him approaching from the side. 10 meters. 5. Taver pulled the pin and threw. The grenade landed inside the truck bed. The explosion shattered the valley. The machine gun fell silent. and in that instant the commandos surged forward. The SS officers tried to flee into the forest. But within minutes, the firefight was over. 4 fugitives lay dead in the snow. Among them was Alexander Müller. The commandos destroyed the vehicles and disappeared before Allied patrols could arrive. Officially, the incident was never recorded. But the message spread quickly through survivor networks. The men responsible for deportations were being found. By 1946, these quiet operations had helped track down numerous Nazi fugitives. Some were turned over to Allied war crimes investigators, others simply disappeared. Yet the story of these soldiers did not end with vengeance. At the same time they were hunting war criminals, many Jewish Brigade veterans began another mission, helping Holocaust survivors rebuild their lives. Across displaced persons camps in Europe, Jewish Brigade soldiers organized escape routes for refugees. They provided transportation, forged documents, and protection. The operation became known as the WW2 movement. Tens of thousands of survivors were smuggled out of Europe and transported toward Palestine. For many refugees, these soldiers were the first sign that the Jewish people had not been erased from history. And for the soldiers themselves, the work carried a deeper meaning. They had spent years fighting a war that destroyed millions of lives. Now they were helping rebuild what had been shattered. Many of those same men would fight again just a few years later during the creation of the State of Israel. Their wartime experience became the foundation for a new army. But the secret missions of the Jewish Brigade's Nazi hunters remained largely unknown for decades, overshadowed by the enormous battles and political decisions that defined the Second World War. Yet hidden within the ruins of that era is this quieter story. A story about soldiers who refused to let the architects of genocide simply disappear into the chaos of history. On frozen roads, in small border towns, and in dark forests where names were whispered among survivors, the hunters continued their work. Because for them, justice was not an abstract idea debated in courtrooms. It was something far more immediate, a promise that the people responsible for one of humanity's greatest crimes would never feel completely safe again. And on more than one winter night in the mountains of Europe, that promise was kept. Stories like this force us to confront an uncomfortable truth about history. The Jewish Brigade soldiers who hunted Nazi fugitives were shaped by one of the greatest tragedies humanity has ever witnessed. The Holocaust showed the world how far cruelty can go when hatred, fear, and power collide. After the war, the world made a promise. Never again. But history keeps asking the same question again and again. What does never again actually mean? Does it mean justice only for the past? Or does it mean protecting human life in the present, wherever war threatens it? Because the real lesson of the Second World War was never about one nation or one people. It was about humanity itself. About what happens when violence becomes normal. And about whether we choose to stop that cycle. Or repeat it. So as you think about this story, ask yourself one question. What does never again mean to you? Because history is still waiting for the answer.